People on Donafield Drive may not have known who their neighbors were, but they knew something wasn't right.
The scary part was to wake up in the morning and find out there was a terrorist cell operating here in their own backyard.
Something illegal going on doesn't surprise me, but when you mention the word terrorism, I'm going, Lord have mercy.
Hezbollah, prior to 9/11, killed more Americans than any terrorist organization.
As soon as I saw that house, I knew something had to be going on. There is strange lot.
Shouting death to America, and there's scenes of violence.
Their mission was to become a sleeper cell, to be activated if ordered to conduct an attack.
We were sitting on a ticking bomb.
Pushing rapidly with tanks at APCs deep into the western sector.
In 1982, in response to the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, several militia groups formed together with the support of Iran to establish a legitimate political party called the Party of God, Hezbollah. They were able to bring water to the communities, to establish hospitals and maintain some semblance of education for the children during this war. In some ways, they are viewed as the savior of Lebanon. But their armed wing, Ansar Allah, the retainers of Allah, is an organized, disciplined, trained, and equipped fighting force.
We do first recognize that Hezbollah has a number of different dimensions to it, but the United States continues to be concerned about terrorist activities that go well beyond the borders of this country.
So on one hand, Hezbollah has a local identity as a legitimate political party in Lebanon. On the other hand, they're a proxy for the Iranian government. They're engaged in terrorist organizations and act as a militia at the behest of Iran.
Iran's sponsorship of Hezbollah is very comprehensive. It's providing weapons, training, intelligence, different types of covers. They view the United States as being the primary supporter of Israel and, by extension, a legitimate, active target. Prior to 9/11, no other terrorist group in the world killed more Americans than Hezbollah. The Marine Corps barracks bombing, 246 men killed. The American Embassy bombing in Lebanon, a horrific, horrific attack. The hijacking of TW-8 Flight 847, where a U.S. Navy diver was singled out and tortured to death by Hezbollah, and countless other attacks in the world.
They have this global footprint. They have established themselves on virtually every continent in the world. In Africa, in Europe, in North America, in South America, in Southeast Asia.
Hezbollah, not being a nation, not being a state, has the ability to travel throughout the world to embed themselves in different communities.
Gaining all this combat experience and being directed, in many cases, by a country that has aspirations of becoming a nuclear power, it makes them extremely dangerous.
In 1992, the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires was bombed by Hezbollah, followed by another attack on the Argentine-Israeli Mutual Association building. I was on assignment in Latin America at the time. Over 100 people had been killed by Hezbollah. Children in the grade school next to the embassy were shredded with glass. And I saw that there had been sleeper agents in those locations. And so when I became chief of the Hezbollah unit in the FBI, so I oversaw all counter-Hezbollah operations worldwide. My primary objective was to find out, are there Hezbollah sleeper cells in the United States?
Sleeper cells are so dangerous because they're well concealed and they fly below law enforcement radar.
A sleeper cell is when foreign operators, could be a terrorist, it could be a spy, will embed themselves into a community. They will join clubs, they will go to school, they'll get a driver's license, they'll get a job. They take on all the appearances of being just another community member.
They're sleepers because they're not committing the type of illegal activities that draw the attention of federal law enforcement.
When actually they're establishing the capability to conduct espionage or conduct an attack, if and when ordered to. In early 1995, an individual had run afoul of Hezbollah and was afraid that he would be killed. And so he walked into an American embassy and said, listen, I need some protection. And he reported that a dangerous Hezbollah operative was currently living in Charlotte, North Carolina. And that operative was Mohammed Hammoud.
Who gave you the tip?
We can't disclose that. At this time, it's still classified. With this information, I contacted the Charlotte office, and they initiated an investigation on this individual. They started coming across more individuals in Charlotte working together. They seemed to have some kind of group. As we got more intelligence from overseas, we started seeing that this could be a Hezbollah cell. No one would be looking for them here. This is not New York. This is not Los Angeles. This is Charlotte, North Carolina, the heart of America. When the vacancy for the terrorism supervisor in North Carolina opened up, I applied for the position and was selected. There was skepticism on the part of our headquarters, and everyone kind of chuckled because terrorism was so far from the minds of the FBI. They thought, there's Bob. You know, he used to be the Hezbollah chief, and now he's saying, oh, they're right here in my backyard. Well, guess what? They were. In early 1995, an individual reported that a dangerous and trained Hezbollah operative was currently living in Charlotte, North Carolina. And that operative was Mohammed Hammoud. Mohammed Hammoud was young, handsome, charismatic. He had considerable combat experience. His father had been killed by the Israeli Defense Force, and he had familial connections with Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah. The Charlotte office started looking at this individual to find out, did Hezbollah have sleeper cells in the United States? Were they collecting intelligence for an attack? Did they pose a threat? For many years, Mohammed Hammoud attempted to get a visa to travel from Lebanon to the United States.
The consular officer that took his request smelled a rat. So Hammoud and his two cousins, the Darwishes, travel to Venezuela, and they spend about 40 days on Margarita Island. And they obtain some really poor fake visas that they know when they get to JFK are going to be spotted.
The three travel on separate planes and arrive in New York. Their false visas are immediately detected.
They caught Mohammed Hammoud red-handed, and then he immediately claimed asylum from Hezbollah, that he was being persecuted by Hezbollah. And they bought it, hook, line, and sinker. So that gave him status, catch and release. He's out to do what he does as a Hezbollah operative here in the United States.
There's another Hezbollah member already in Charlotte, North Carolina, and his name, Said Harb. He came to Charlotte from Lebanon in 1988, a wheeler, dealer, very astute with criminal activity.
If Harb can make a buck, he would. And he was engaged in such a broad range of criminality, everything from visa fraud, marriage fraud, identity theft. He could talk a tin ear off a brass monkey. Said Harb could. So Hammoud and his cousins come down to Charlotte, where they took jobs at Domino's. They wanted you to believe that they were here just looking for a better life. And Said convinced each of them to pay an American woman to marry them so that they could obtain a green card. He went out and found exotic dancers in Charlotte area, strip clubs, and then their Domino's co-workers.
The concept here is that you think you're just dealing with an immigrant seeking residency. You have no idea you're dealing with a terrorist. You know, I come here to Charlotte looking at this cell. Who are they speaking with? What they were doing? And we start getting a picture of 8 core Hezbollah operatives. Each one of these cell members was battle-hardened, but engaging in low-level criminal activity. And I knew that all it would take would be some action in the world against Iran. It could be something that occurs in the Middle East or Asia, but in order to retaliate, Hezbollah could order an attack in the United States. I bring it to my fellow supervisors in the office saying, can you help me investigate these crimes? I want to be able to have some kind of leverage to arrest them, to put pressure on them.
I was initially skeptical that Charlotte, North Carolina would be some hotbed for a terrorist organization like Hezbollah. And I thought, well, maybe we're just trying to be relevant here. Maybe we're trying too hard to be considered an important field office.
And they say, Bob, the FBI does not investigate or pursue such low-level crime. We'd like to, Bob, we just can't.
Before 9/11 and before the Patriot Act, there was a strict wall between criminal and intelligence investigators.
Back in the 70s, the FBI had its wings clipped. The legislature and the country said, we don't want you to be spying on people in the United States. Intelligence cases are entirely separate from criminal cases.
The intelligence side was to gather information, not to gather evidence, not to put people in jail.
We were addressing terrorism like we did spies. Identify them, monitor them. There was no policy to break these cells up, but we had to find some way to pursue them. One night, I was finishing up some work, very late in the office, probably everyone was gone. I went outside my office and saw an agent there doing some paperwork. I introduced myself and we started speaking.
Bob caught me at a good time. I'd spent the first 11 years of my FBI career working criminal cases. Despite the fact that I'd been an intelligence officer in the Army, had traveled extensively throughout the Middle East, had Arabic language training, the Bureau put me to work on criminal squads.
Rick Schwein had just come off of a very successful motorcycle gang investigation and prosecution. This is exactly how I viewed this Hezbollah cell. All the things we see in a terrorist cell, you see in an outlaw motorcycle gang. And that's why I needed an agent who understood both worlds.
Right off the bat, it's like, you know what, we've got a RICO case here. These guys are committing all these different crimes, and we can prove the enterprise.
His expertise was cases involving racketeering influenced corrupt organizations called RICO cases, in which you group together individuals and prosecute them in that manner.
These people were affiliated because of their membership in Hezbollah. And because they were engaged in criminality, they were vulnerable to the use of criminal statutes, to including the racketeering statutes.
That was their Achilles heel, because in no other manner could we attack them except through criminal prosecution.
By prosecuting them for racketeering, they'll no longer ever have the chance to set that bomb off in the United States.
To investigate the breadth of their criminal activity, we put together what I call a de facto Joint Terrorism Task Force. Was it funded? No. Was it official? No. But it was our task force.
So we effectively developed this network to counter the Hezbollah network.
From the Diplomatic Security Service, from the Immigration and Naturalization Service, from the Charlotte Police Department, to all lend their jurisdiction into a common effort. Our goal was to not only penetrate the cell, but to dismantle it, and to tell Hezbollah, we know who you are, and you will not be able to do that here. The Charlotte Hezbollah case began in earnest in March of 1997. The Charlotte cell was made up of 8 Hezbollah operatives sent here to support Hezbollah and to be activated if and when ordered to carry out a terrorist attack. So we had assembled our de facto Joint Terrorism Task Force. Everyone had their expertise. We're working together to further develop this terrorism investigation. And this case is called Operation Smokescreen.
It's a manpower-intensive effort to conduct a physical surveillance of a terrorism target. A number of people doing different things in order to stay on a target and not get exposed.
One of the things we did was to rent the house across the street from Mohammed Hammoud. We needed FBI agents portraying themselves as a young married couple to monitor that residence 24 hours a day, to find out who's coming in there, at what time, what's happening there.
Mohammed Hammoud was sort of the spiritual leader and had grown up in South Lebanon and knew the Hezbollah leadership. So he was networked. He knew the players.
And every Thursday night, he would have a gathering at his home.
These Thursday night meetings were not just core cell members, just like biker gangs, they had hang-arounds. And they would come and Mohammed Hammoud would preach to them.
And he was almost a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde personality. He was a really low-key, polite young man on one hand, and then at the prayer meetings, he would get fired up, and he would be the motivational speaker.
He would show speeches by Hezbollah leadership. He would show videos of Hezbollah operations overseas.
And they would cheer as these attacks were depicted on their propaganda videos, killing Americans, killing people. And then he'd solicit donations for the cause.
Did you have someone on the inside of the cell?
I can never discuss sources or methods. After this hour had passed, a lot of people would leave, but there was a core group there. And then they would start talking about their activities.
With Hezbollah, the marquee activities are bombing buildings and airplanes and high-profile attacks. What we don't pay much attention to is how do they fund themselves? How does ISIS fund itself? How does Al-Qaeda fund itself? They're generating income, operating businesses, blending in, and they use that money to finance terrorism against us.
Mohammed Ahmad was the cell leader, but the brains behind this entire conspiracy, this entire operation, it's Said Harb.
So Said Harb, one of the things that he really got good at was adopting people's identities. He would make friends with people in the community in Charlotte, and they would go back to their country of origin, and before they went back, he'd say, hey, can I get your driver's license? And then he would basically adopt that identity and get a North Carolina driver's license in that name. And he had, 7 or 8 identities like that. His phone would ring different ways depending on which identity he was being called on, so he could keep his identity straight. Almost all of them had an alternate identity. And Mohammed Ahmad had developed an alternate identity using the same methodology.
With that identity, they would apply and obtain credit cards. They would then charge each one of these to its maximum amount, purchasing cigarettes at one of the warehouses here.
North Carolina is a tobacco-producing state. Cigarettes are taxed at a very low rate. I think it was 50 cents, right, carton. Whereas in the northern states, they were taxed at up to $13 a carton.
They would drive these cigarettes, a complete truckload, to Detroit or New York, where they would sell them to these small mom-and-pop shops.
They would resell them and undercut their competition because they weren't paying the taxes. So there were a number of traffic stops where police officers in different states would stop these people with a van load of cigarettes. The cell members were afraid they were being profiled as Arab males.
So then what did they do? They hired females to drive these cigarettes up to Michigan or to New York.
Said Harb was very good at recruiting females to drive for the group because he's just a charismatic guy. They all met and worked together at Domino's. That was the public facade. And that's how a lot of women got sucked into making the smuggling runs.
We estimate that every truckload of cigarettes netted about $30,000.
And making 4 or 5 trips a week.
How long did they do that?
For several years.
So how much did they make?
Over $8 million. And this was just one of their criminal schemes.
They then used this money to purchase a pizza franchise, a house painting business, a used car lot, a gas station where they can launder these funds. Not only that, if they need more money, they commit insurance fraud. We know that they intentionally set fire to a pizza business they had for more money.
So when you look at this case in its pieces, it's cigarette smuggling, so what? The credit card fraud and the identity fraud, yawn. And that's by design. It allows this organization to fly below the radar.
But when you realize that you're dealing with terrorists, that they're going to exploit this innocuous criminal activity with lethal effectiveness, it changes the entire perspective of this.
They're taking the proceeds from these crimes and sending it to a terrorist organization that prior to 9/11 killed more Americans than any terrorist organization.
We continued to watch them for a long period of time without moving against them to ensure that this case was successful. My concern was that sleeper cells could be activated to conduct an attack based on something totally unrelated to where they are.
When you're trained to think in terms of worst case is an attack on the homeland.
We knew that this cell had weapons, and they were conducting firearms practice with handguns and long rifles on the outskirts of Charlotte.
These people had military training. They'd been to camps in the Bekaa. They'd been trained by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. They'd served in militias where they got combat experience. They didn't leave all that behind. They were keeping their skills sharp.
In any criminal investigation, you're investigating a biker gang, they could kill somebody tomorrow. In federal investigations, you have to be patient. If you step in and you don't dig it up by the roots, the weeds just come right back.
When we investigated this case, we started talking to other agencies, and I found out that ATF had this ready-to-go cigarette smuggling case. Alcohol, tobacco, and firearms had expended several years doing traffic stops and gathering evidence. This was much bigger than a cigarette smuggling case. This was a terrorism case, and they didn't understand what they had.
I find out that the ATF is about to make arrests, which would completely destroy what we have been doing for over a year.
I found out about the ATF case. I went to Bob and I said, hey, they're getting ready to indict this. We need to go to the U.S. Attorney's Office.
The ATF had this cigarette smuggling investigation in our office, and it had been there a year or two.
And they see me come in the door, and right away it's like, oh, here comes the FBI swooping in to take our case. And I say, stop. Before I say anything more, everyone in this room is going to sign a non-disclosure agreement. And they're like, what?
I think that's the first time in my then 15 years of being a prosecutor that I'd ever had to do that.
It was very dramatic. Bob had him sign non-disclosure agreements because we were going to brief him on the intelligence case and the ties to Hezbollah.
So they started walking us through essentially the case that the ATF had been working on with the cigarette smuggling. Several slides of surveillance and some of the evidence had been gathered, and the U.S. Attorney and I were both, where is this going?
And I say, this is not a tobacco tax evasion scheme.
They put a slide up on the screen of 8 men and said, there's a Hezbollah cell in Charlotte.
And the room goes quiet.
Bob's a really good briefer. So when he gave that presentation to Ken and the U.S. Attorney, it was compelling. It was compelling.
I leaned over to the U.S. Attorney and I said, I think I'll take this one.
Ken Bell was the chief of prosecuting criminal investigations in the Western District of North Carolina.
I met with the ATF agents and said, we're going to have to slow down indictments in this case, and I can't tell you why right now, but they were unaware that the people they were investigating were Hezbollah.
Ken, as the lead prosecutor, immediately established a liaison with the Department of Justice.
We had meetings in D.C. to discuss the investigation, and I think it was at one of those meetings that somebody just said to me, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service has an investigation related to this, and they have information that would be of great interest to you. And I said, well, what would that be? I said, we can't tell you. And so I said, well, I guess we should go to Ottawa and meet with them and ask them what they have that would be of interest to me. So several of us, including Rick Schwein, took that trip to Ottawa to meet with CSIS, Canadian Security Intelligence Service, which is sort of their CIA.
That began a very long dance with Canadian authorities at very high levels. It was like, yeah, we're willing to listen to you, but we don't want to give up our sources and methods. They had a guy, their head legal guy, his name was Mike, and he's this big, burly Canadian guy.
And he's a former Royal Canadian Mounted Police, just a bear of a man.
So we're sitting at this big conference table. We've been at it all day. I'm tired. I'm not going to lie to you. I was tired. Mike, out of nowhere, goes, I'm going to go get a smoke. Anybody want to go?
I think it was January or February in Ottawa. It was cold as hell.
It's probably like 20 below out. I mean, it's freaking cold. And Ken Bell was sitting across the table from me, and I kicked him under the table, and I said, Ken, go smoke with him.
I wasn't really much of a smoker, but I said, okay, I'll go.
I don't know what they said. You'll have to ask Ken. But they had a rooftop conversation, and things changed right after that.
He said, Ken, what do you really want? And I said, well, Mike, we want to take CSIS's holdings and take them into a federal courtroom and use them to convict a bunch of terrorists. And he said, I think we can help.
The Canadian Security Intelligence Service had been conducting surveillance on Saeed Harb and watched him cross into Canada because the Canadians had this other cell in Vancouver. Saeed's best friend, Mohammed Dabouk, was the leader of the Canadian cell. They'd grown up together. And Dabouk had volunteered to be a suicide bomber several times. And he had produced all these combat videos of martyrdom operations. The Canadians had surveilled Harb in Canada, and he had provided Dabouk with alias identifications and counterfeit credit cards. They had him in a cigarette pack, and that was to help facilitate the purchase of dual-use equipment that they couldn't get access to or weren't being given access to in Lebanon and Iran.
Dual-use equipment is not illegal to possess. Things like night vision goggles, they can be used for benign purposes. They can be used for military purposes to kill people. You can possess a stun gun. You can possess GPS. But you know what they're using that for? Mortar rounds, to create fields of fire. Stun guns, what are you going to do with a stun gun? You're going to torture somebody.
Some of the stuff that they were getting looked like they were trying to build a remotely piloted vehicle or drone. And then ultimately we know in 2006, Hezbollah successfully used drones against the Israelis. Once the Canadians agreed to share their information, it completely changed the dynamic of the case. And the reason for that is it really paints the global reach of Hezbollah.
The cell in North Carolina would send money to Canada. The Hezbollah cell there would purchase these items and then transship them to Hezbollah in Lebanon and throughout the world.
And Canadian surveillance picked up Hassan Halou Lakis, the head of Hezbollah's procurement operations globally, directing Dubuque to obtain this equipment. You've got a cell in North Carolina, a cell in Canada. You've got key players in Hezbollah in Lebanon directing these activities. It's a global operation. So you had this statute that was on the books that gave you a tool to go after these organizations nobody had really used yet.
This statute, called a material support statute, makes it illegal to assist a designated terrorist group with something of a material nature, money, weapons, dual-use equipment.
Providing support to a terrorist organization is the same as being a terrorist. And in this case in particular, this 8-member terrorism financing cell could become a bomb-throwing terrorist cell with the flip of a switch.
So one of the things that became very apparent was a desire by the United States government to test the statute, to make a material support case against a terrorist organization.
And headquarters wanted the material support statute to be used as a vital tool in our fight against terrorism, but they had to show it could work.
The case progresses, and I was constantly getting communications from the highest levels of the FBI. Bob, when are we going to take this down? When are we going to make it? Because there was a concern that even if a small attack took place, are you telling me that the FBI knew a Hezbollah cell was operating for 4 years and you did nothing?
And I felt, just like any other criminal enterprise case, that you had to have an insider. We needed somebody that could talk about the dynamics within the group, and we needed somebody that could definitively say that money was going to Hezbollah. I found out that the core group got together on Sunday afternoons and played soccer at a park in Charlotte. So I went to the park, and they were some players short, and I managed to get an invitation to play, and I spent the afternoon kicking a soccer ball and playing in a pickup game with the people that we had under investigation, with the core Hezbollah cell. The Darwishes, the Hamouds, Saeed Harb. And it was interesting because you can tell a lot about somebody on a soccer pitch. Hamoud was quiet, and Harb was one of these bigger-than-life guys. Very skilled player, very selfish player. And the game ended, and the core group, the cousins and the brothers, went off to eat together. Harb didn't go with them, and he went to a bar, watched a football game, ordered some alcohol, and I thought, you know what? This is somebody that's going to become our insider down the road.
You thought you could flip him?
I thought I could flip him.
Anytime you're dealing with a terrorist organization, which we considered the Charlotte Hezbollah cell to be, you run the risk they're going to commit some violent act. And so you hold the safety of the American people in your hands.
It was my decision. At a very specific time, I thought we have enough criminal information to dismantle this Hezbollah cell. At that time, I said, let's take it down.
So Rick Schwein begins preparing an affidavit for searches.
We drafted a 100-plus page affidavit. It's one of the longest affidavits I've ever written.
Like myself, we both were biker gangs. We were killing the biker gangs with the RICO statute. And one of the things we would do before we indicted a RICO case was go hit their clubhouses and find indicia of an organization doing things together to commit criminal acts.
So we fashioned the search warrant so that we could seize evidence that would support a RICO prosecution and also support a material support prosecution.
Rick assured me that, Bob, we can make this RICO case. We're not sure about material support, but this was the very best opportunity that the FBI, that the United States had to successfully prosecute them in that manner with a law that's never been tried before.
And there was a lot of pressure not to fail. And there were a lot of people who questioned whether it could be done.
I called together a team of 250 officers.
So hundreds of agents from all different agencies, state, local, and federal, gathered together at the command post to get their briefing, to fan out and conduct searches and arrests across Charlotte. This is a massive operation.
They all had to happen exactly at the same time, or word would get around and you'd lose defendants and you'd lose evidence.
I remember Chris Wecker tapped me on the shoulder while I'm briefing all of our agents. They're getting their search packages. I'm talking about the case, giving them a complete view. And Chris taps me on the shoulder and says, "This has been put on hold. I have to go up to Washington."
There was a huge backlash from the Justice Department, starting with Janet Reno. So the operation was halted in its tracks. 200 officers, 18 search sites, a massive operation by one person, the Attorney General. I felt like, oh no, we could lose this case.
I mean, I had all these people standing by, ready to go. The op orders had been written. You know, I'm the criminal case agent. This is why I exist, to go kick doors down and put people in handcuffs and gather evidence.
Rick Schwein being passionate and emotional, we had to peel him off the ceiling.
And I have no idea if we're going to be able to execute tomorrow or never.
Ken and I decided we had to get to D.C. as quickly as we could. We needed to convince her in a very compelling way that this needed to go forward. So a lot was riding on that trip to D.C. So we went and had a meeting with the Attorney General, sitting at the head of a long conference table.
You know, it was a stressful setting because, all right, so we spent years now doing this. We're ready to go. And Attorney General Reno started asking questions about, well, in this search warrant affidavit, it says Hezbollah terrorists.
The Attorney General was very hypersensitive about calling people terrorists when you're not arresting them for terrorism itself, and said you're arresting them for racketeering, credit card fraud, cigarette smuggling, money laundering, and you're calling them terrorists in this affidavit. That needs to come out. The Attorney General looked over at one of her subordinates and said, "You and Ken and Chris go in the other room and work through this."
Long story short, we had to rewrite the search warrant affidavit to take out every word that the Department of Justice found offensive.
102 pages. And we went through it line by line with a ruler. So we fixed the affidavit to their satisfaction. We caught the next plane out. We called Bob Clifford. We said verbally over the phone, "Get ready to go."
And so on July 21st, 2000, at 6 o'clock in the morning, with 250 agents, 3 SWAT teams spread out in various locations, I give the order, execute.
A 3.5-year investigation of cigarette smuggling and terrorism came to a blaring climax today.
ATF SWAT team did the entry at Mohammed Hammoud's house. Hammoud grabbed a handgun as the team was making entry, and he dropped it as the entry team was coming up the hallway. He gave up peacefully.
Nearly 20 people arrested, and soon residents amazed to discover that their neighbors are actually suspected of supporting a notorious Middle Eastern terrorist organization.
The arrests of 17 individuals and the searches of 19 locations happen at the same time.
I was on the team that was going to Saeed Harb's house, and they bring Saeed and his family out. I had been focused on Harb because I really felt we needed that inside view. I introduced myself and tell him I'm with the FBI. I'm obviously wearing a raid jacket. And the first thing he says to me is, "Hey, why the SWAT team? It's not like I'm a terrorist or anything." And I just said, "Well, we're going to talk about that." So he says, "You look familiar." And I said, "Well, I played soccer with you one Sunday." I guess he figured out that if I was playing soccer with him, I really knew everything I needed to know about his life. He had this recognition on his face that he was in big trouble. We had a staging area at the National Guard Armory where we processed, fingerprinted all these guys. We took him to a room, we Mirandized him, and we interviewed him. So he talked about the cigarette smuggling and the credit card fraud and the alias identifications, and he really just talked and talked and talked. And after several hours, we got him something to eat. He finally looked at me and he said, "Put your pen down, stop writing." And I said, "Okay." Put my pen aside. He said, "I know why you're doing this to me. You want Dubuque, you want Hezbollah."
I remember Rick and Bob coming to me and saying, "We need a live witness to testify about material support or we won't be able to make the case.
We Mirandized Saeed Harb, and we interviewed him. And we talked to him for several hours. He finally looked at me and he said, "You want Dubuque, you want Hezbollah." It was one of those great moments that you live for as an investigator, right? He knows I know what this is about, and that's the opening. And he said, "I can't talk to you about that right now, and I need to think about this." And that's when the Canadian information became critical.
That Canadian evidence showed that he had direct contact with Mohammed Dubuque in Vancouver. We had surveillance photographs of Dubuque and Harb together, photographs of them together with fraudulent credit cards, meeting at times and places to acquire dual-use military equipment for Hezbollah.
Once he knew he was going to be charged with material support to terrorism, that's when he knew he had to strike a deal. The negotiation turned to, "I will cooperate with you, but I've got concerns about my family in Lebanon."
His view was, and I expect he's right, that if it came to be known that he was cooperating in our prosecution, his family would be dead.
So Ken was the guy that was taking the point on moving the family to the U.S.
That wasn't my first idea of how to get Harb's cooperation, but it was a necessary thing. We wanted his cooperation. We wanted to be able to tell the story fully, and to do that, that was his condition.
The full power of the United States government was put into play to make that happen.
But they were thoroughly vetted. I mean, these were like children, women, grandparents.
We flew them out and brought them en masse to Washington to a hotel.
And that happened over Easter weekend of 2002, I think.
Was it secret?
I mean, it's pretty ineffective to try to get smuggled people out of the country. People know you're trying to smuggle them out of the country. We didn't want Hezbollah to know, that's for sure.
And as soon as his family was spirited out of Lebanon, he signed the plea agreement and agreed to testify.
Sirens blasting, shotguns at the ready, federal agents took extraordinary measures today as they led 17 men and women with alleged links to a terrorist group into the federal courthouse in Charlotte.
We went to trial in June of 2002. There was a lot of security in place, and there were counter snipers on rooftops and helicopter patrols and a lot of security with the movement of the defendants in the case.
And the courthouse in Charlotte, North Carolina became just a big circus.
Harb cooperated completely, testified not only to what was going on out of Canada with the dual-use equipment and Mohammed Dubuque's role. He confirmed for us that Mohammed Hammoud was raising money for criminal conduct.
One by one, the cell members were pleading guilty, and 24 individuals pled guilty to marriage fraud, document fraud, RICO. Only 2 left standing were Hammoud and his brother. They went to trial.
Did you cross-examine Mohammed Hammoud?
I did. It's nerve-wracking. Everybody expects the Perry Mason moment, right? You get the defendant on the stand and he admits that he's guilty. And he admitted that he supported Hezbollah, but only the charitable wing of it. But they engage in violent acts and sponsor violent acts all over the world.
Hezbollah paid very close attention to this. They followed the trial closely.
How do you know?
I just know.
The FBI had an informant in the county jail where Mohammed Hammoud was being held, who told them that Hammoud had put out a contract to first blow up the evidence at the courthouse, and that he also wanted 2 bullets in the brain of that arrogant bastard prosecutor.
Is that you?
Apparently, yeah.
We acted on that very quickly. You know, we were able to take some steps to protect Ken and his family.
There was law enforcement all over my house. The FBI wanted to send agents to my kids' schools to pick them up. They wanted my wife and sons to leave the area and go into protective custody. The FBI put a remote starter on my car. I started carrying a weapon, and I was thinking, if they want me dead, I will be dead.
We confronted him about it, and of course he denied it. We polygraphed the source. We learned that Hammoud was open to the idea of the prosecutor being killed, but it wasn't his idea. But he was quite willing to go along with it. There was no doubt about that.
My wife thought when it came out, because it was in the Charlotte Observer front page, arrogant bastard prosecutor. She said, you know, what wife gets to see confirmation of what she's known for years right in the newspaper, that her husband's an arrogant bastard?
The jury went out, and the jury stayed out for 3 days to come back with the verdict of guilty. We immediately notified headquarters. We have got the first material support conviction in the country.
Originally, Mohammed Hammoud was sentenced to 155 years in prison. There was an appeal that went up to the Supreme Court, and he was sentenced to 30 years.
What happened to Saeed?
He was sentenced, did a prison term. He's out of prison now and has been for some time.
Smokescreen broke up what federal prosecutors say was a ring.
Smokescreen still is the most important terrorism case, talking about terrorist organizations and how they fund themselves.
It was a benchmark case for the first use of the material support statute. It was the first conviction at trial in American history.
And the proof now is the fact that it's been used over 100 times since this case came about. It is the primary tool to address ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Every single indictment of an ISIS or Al-Qaeda person has included material support.
Are there Hezbollah sleeper cells in the United States today?
Absolutely. They do low-level criminal activity that generates a lot of money, so it's hard to picture them as this thoroughly dangerous organization that they are.
It's not a leap that this cell could have become operational if it was in the best interest of Hezbollah or Iran.
I would submit that Hezbollah represents a clear and present danger to the United States right now, because with all the attention paid to ISIL, just in the corners, just under the radar, is Hezbollah. As a matter of fact, Hezbollah is stronger than ever.